overview of the Bible, the Judges. We have two prominent books in that time frame, Judges and Ruth. And in the left top corner, you have the time, 1200 to 1020 BC, the Judges. The events between the entry into the Promised Land and the establishment of the monarchy of Israel, those will be the time of the Judges. So it's the time when they entered and the time before they got their first king. So they entered the Promised Land, they didn't have a king, they were all over the place, and the people who helped them to have a little bit of order were the Judges. Judges and Ruth. 12 tribes were not closely united because they got into this new country. They were all over the place. But this was a dark period. Faith in God dwindled during this period. And remember, God made a covenant. Abram, I'm going to use your family to become a big nation. And now God's promise is in trouble because they have turned their eyes away from God. God's rescue plan is in jeopardy at this moment. But there was a ray of light in dark times. God always works behind the scene. And how did he do that? God uses Ruth and Boaz. Ruth was a Moabite. And she was the daughter-in-law of, what was her name? Starts with an N. Naomi. And then Naomi went to another country, the Moabites, because there was famine in Israel, and her son married Ruth, and he died, her husband died, and the other son died. Then she decided, I will go back to my people. And Ruth, the Moabite, said, I will go with you. Your God will be my God. But what is so amazing behind this? The Israelites didn't like the Moabites. They said, the Moabites will never be part of us. And God's promise to Abram was, you, Abram, need to be a blessing to the nations. And now in this period, the Israelites said, we don't like the Moabites. God didn't like that, but God wanted them to be a blessing to the Moabites. So God used a Moabite woman. She came to Israel, and then she married, what was his name? It was a family member of Naomi, Boaz. And then they got a baby. And what was the name of that baby? Obed. And Obed became part of the family line of David, and then later Jesus. And when you read Matthew 1, you get the name of Ruth, you get the name of other women, and that was God's way to include those people who the Israelites didn't want to bless. God included them because God was working behind the scene. So that was the ray of light. God was bringing this Moabite, and he told her, you will become part of my family because I made a promise to Abram. I wanted to be a blessing. Is that okay for you? Mm-hmm. Just remember always the covenant, the covenant as our rescue plan. Then it gets to the fifth block, the United Kingdom. There you have all the books. I'm not going to read the books. You have the time frame plus minus 1020 to 925, the United Kingdom. So they're in the Promised Land, and then they realized, but all the other nations have kings. And then they went to Samuel. He was the priest, he was the prophet, he was a well-known guy in Israel. They said, but everyone has a king, we want a king as well. And God was not happy with that because God is their king. But then God told Samuel, give them the second best. If they want to have a king, just give them their king. So the monarchy was established during the United Kingdom. 3 kings. Saul, and who was the next king? David. The next one? Solomon. Correct. God continues to work out his rescue plan for the nations. They wanted a king and a human being as a king, but in spite of that, God didn't turn his back. He was working behind the scenes, remembering his covenant to Abram, and he continues to work out a rescue plan for his people. There you have the 12 tribes of Israel on the screen. Now it brings us to our sixth block. You will find that on page number 28. Correct. The divided kingdom and exile. Overview of the Bible, the divided kingdom and exile. You have the time there and all the books that will be represented. The first point. What is the consequence of breaking the covenant through idolatry? A divided kingdom. Solomon was a great guy, but he, for his way to get more land and for his way to get more power, he took over also the idolatry, the religions of other people, just to keep everyone happy. And God was not happy with that. And then the kingdom divided in two. But there's another major reason why the kingdom divided in two. Solomon needed a lot of money for his building project, so he taxed the people a lot. But because he was part of the two southern tribes, he was from that family, he taxed the 10 northern tribes more money. And when Solomon died, they came to his son, who was the next king, and said, please, we beg you, don't tax us so much money. Then he said, I'm going to even tax you more than my dad. And then they decided, enough is enough. And then they said, we don't want to be part of you. And then the kingdom divided in two. And this is what happens when you turn your eyes from God. The vision, a divided kingdom. We read about the divided kingdom in 1 Kings 11, verse 9, and 1 Kings 12, verse 14. The 10 northern tribes are called Israel. They consist of 10 tribes. The 2 southern tribes are called Judah. How we summarize this? God continues to be committed to his covenants. How did he do that? There was the vision, they've messed up, then God raised prophets, and he used the prophets to tell the people, turn back to God, turn back to the 10 commandments, repent. So that was God's way to stay in touch with his people. God told the prophet, go to my people and tell them to repent. Does that make sense to you? So although they mess up, God sticks with them. So there you have the divided kingdom on the picture. Israel will be north and Judah will be south. It continues with the next slide, the divided kingdom and exile. In 722 BC, the northern kingdom came to an end, because the world power then were the Assyrians, and they took the 10 northern tribes into exile. And they never returned back. But the Assyrians had a strategy to take away the power of the people they conquered. So they took away the best Israelites, the hard-working, and only those ones who were weak stayed behind. And then they took people from all over the world and put them in Israel to make it very unstable. And the people who came to live there, who intermarried with the Israelites, who didn't go into exile, a new nation was formed, and we call that the Samaritans. Now you understand in the New Testament why the Jews didn't like them, because they were half Jews. They intermarried other people. So 722, the end of the northern kingdom. They continued to sin against God and ignored the prophet's warnings. That's why God said, enough. What's going to happen to God's covenant, his promise? But they didn't want to listen. They ignored him. Many years later, in 586 BC, the 2 southern tribes came to an end. Babylon became the world power, and they took the 2 southern tribes into exile. The unthinkable happened. Jerusalem collapsed. They couldn't believe that. They believed Jerusalem is indestructible because God lives in the temple. And then it collapsed. What is going to happen with God's covenant he made to Abram Everyone is now gone in exile. How will God fulfill, and that's the question, how will God fulfill his promise to Abraham and Israel that you will see now on the screen? How will God do that? God has a problem. He made a promise. I will never turn my back on you. But they didn't want to listen. That brings us now in exile. Now they are in exile. Then the two books is Ezekiel and Daniel. There was a changed way of worship because they used to go to the temple in Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is destroyed. Now they are in exile. There's no temple. So there was a changed way of worship. From temple sacrifices in Jerusalem to prayer, confession, and teachings in houses. What's going to happen? How will God fulfill his promise? He has a huge problem now. They are in exile. So there you have on the map, 722, the Assyrians took them into captivity, and in 586, the Babylonians, who became the world power, took them to Babylon into captivity, where they had a new kind of worship. Questions? Does that make sense? Great. Let's go to the next block. Return from exile. God is faithful. You have the books involved in the right corner and left corner. You will have the date, 538 to 420 BC. The Persians became the new world power. It was first Assyrians, Babylonians, now the Persians. And they encouraged the repatriation of the Israelites and also subsidized it. It was just amazing. They said, no, we rule the world, but you can move back, but under our conditions. You see the book of Esther there, Esther, Mordecai, Haman, it all happened in this period. But all the devotions in the Bible as a GPS book will cover this period in detail as well. The first group returned plus minus 536 BC and started to rebuild the temple. The next main group returned in 458 BC with Ezra. And then the next group, Nehemiah, returned with another group in 444 BC. How will we summarize this block? The exiles who returned were called Jews for the first time. Derived from Yehudi, a Hebrew word which is related to Judah. That's just for interest's sake. But it shows us that God is faithful. God used an orphan, Esther, to become a queen in a foreign country and ask her husband, the king of Persia, let my people go. God was working behind the scenes and is faithful to his covenant. God remains faithful in keeping, you can see that on the screen, in keeping his promises, using prophets to point to the Messiah. And that's why we have the 10 blocks or the 9 blocks on the incline, because we're getting closer to the Messiah that needs to be born.